Number 1. Mason Wayne Sisk was 14 years old, a freshman at Elkmont High School in North Alabama, when his life and the lives around him veered into tragedy. Classmates and teachers knew him as a quiet teenager living with his father, John Sisk, his stepmother, Mary Sisk, and 3 younger siblings in a modest home outside the small town of Elkmont. Mary worked as a special education teacher in the Huntsville area and was described by colleagues as devoted and compassionate, the kind of educator who treated students like family. Outwardly, the household appeared ordinary, with school, church, and weekend visits to friends, until tensions that had simmered out of sight surfaced in the most devastating way. In the months leading up to the killings, pieces of a troubled picture emerged. A teacher later recalled noticing a worried, detached look on Mason's face the week before Labor Day and passing that concern along to school staff. Prosecutors would later say that in a recorded interview, Mason spoke about frequent arguing at home and said he was fed up, a phrase that investigators highlighted as they tried to understand his mindset. While defense attorneys challenged the reliability of his statements and questioned whether outside influences had been fully explored, the broad theme from the state's case centered on a teenager under strain in a conflicted household. On the night of Monday, September 2, 2019, 5 members of the Sisk family were shot inside their home. Initially, Mason told deputies he had been in the basement playing video games when he heard gunfire and saw a vehicle speeding away. That account quickly unraveled under questioning, and authorities said the 14-year-old admitted to the shootings and helped locate a discarded handgun nearby. The victims were his father, John Sisk, his stepmother, Mary Sisk, and the children, Grayson, Aurora, and Colson. Investigators emphasized that the focus of their case would be on sequence and responsibility rather than graphic detail. Detectives gathered evidence from the home and interviews, and the case moved slowly through juvenile detention and then adult court after prosecutors announced he would be charged as an adult with multiple counts of capital murder. The first trial, held in the fall of 2022, ended abruptly in a mistrial after newly extracted data from a victim's cell phone surfaced, and both sides needed time to review it. A retrial began in April of the following year in Athens, Alabama. After roughly a couple of hours of deliberation, jurors found Mason Sisk guilty of capital murder on multiple counts, including the killings of more than one person in a single course of conduct and the killings of children under the age of 14. At sentencing in early September of 2023, Limestone County Circuit Judge Chadwick Wise imposed life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment courts reserve for the rarest juvenile cases. In a written order, the judge called the crime ghastly and disturbing, language that echoed national coverage and stirred debate over juvenile life without parole sentences. The defense filed post-trial motions and later an appeal. In the fall of 2024, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction. Community reaction had been a mix of shock, grief, and exhaustion, with special attention paid to the memory of Mary and the children by schools and neighbors who knew them. Experts who followed the case pointed to a blend of situational stressors and adolescent impulsivity rather than a single clear motive. Prosecutors leaned on Mason's own words about conflict at home. The defense argued that the confession was coerced and that evidence did not conclusively place the gun in his hands. Ultimately, jurors accepted the state's account, and the court determined that the severity and circumstances justified the harshest sentence allowed for a juvenile under Alabama law. As of today, Mason Wayne Sisk is serving life without the possibility of parole in the Alabama prison system, with his conviction affirmed on appeal. Number 2. Evan Miller was 14 years old, a 9th grader from the small town of Moulton in Lawrence County, Alabama, when his case would ultimately change national law on juvenile sentencing. Neighbors knew him as a slight, restless teenager who drifted between school and home, a boy whose family life was unstable and marked by frequent moves and adult problems that spilled into the household. Before the crime, his public image was not that of a hardened delinquent so much as a kid on the margins, struggling with supervision, substance exposure, and the search for belonging that often defines early adolescence. The man who lived a short walk away, 52-year-old Cole Cannon, was a neighbor Miller, and his circle knew casually, the kind of proximity that made the tragedy feel even more intimate to the community. Pressure points were already visible. Accounts presented later in court described a home life shadowed by poverty, instability, and exposure to alcohol and drugs, factors that can magnify impulsivity in developing teens. On the evening in question, Miller and a similarly aged peer spent time with Cannon, drinking and using marijuana. What began as a reckless, substance-fueled hangout with an older neighbor slid toward theft and confrontation, a shift that prosecutors framed as a rapid escalation rather than a carefully planned attack. The defense, for its part, emphasized Miller's youth, trauma, and the brain science that underpinned later Supreme Court rulings about adolescent judgment and susceptibility to pressure. The crime unfolded in mid-July of 2003. Inside Cannon's mobile home in Moulton, evidence and testimony established that after Cannon fell asleep, a robbery attempt triggered violence. The neighbor was struck with a bat, and the home was set on fire, a setting that compounded the fatal outcome through smoke and injuries. There was no stranger-on-stranger mystery here. The victim was the teenager's neighbor, someone the boys knew. Witness recollections and statements referenced disturbing remarks in the moment, details the court weighed as indicators of state of mind, though jurors were also reminded to consider the fog of intoxication and adolescence. The narrative of method and sequence became the backbone of the state's case. While both sides avoided gratuitous detail in open court, detectives quickly focused on the two teens, building the case through interviews, physical evidence from the burned trailer, and statements that placed both youths at the scene. Miller was charged as an adult with capital murder, and 3 years later, in the autumn of 2006, received a mandatory sentence of life in prison, without the possibility of parole, while his co-defendant received life with a chance of parole. The legal story did not end there. Miller's appeal traveled to the United States Supreme Court, which in late June of 2012 ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles are unconstitutional, requiring individualized consideration of youth and its mitigating factors. The ruling did not guarantee release. It required a new discretionary hearing. That resentencing eventually unfolded in Lawrence County. After a detailed hearing that examined Miller's upbringing, development behind bars, and the specifics of the crime, the judge concluded in late April of 2021 that, even under a discretionary system, the legal criteria for life without parole were met. The decision echoed parallel national developments, including a separate Supreme Court case clarifying that judges need not make a specific finding of permanent incorrigibility to impose such a sentence if discretion is exercised. For the family of Cole Cannon, the resentencing closed a long loop. Relatives publicly described years of grief and their belief that the punishment should match the harm. Psychologically, experts have described the case as a collision of adolescent impulsivity, substance use, and a volatile home environment, rather than a single, simple motive like revenge or thrill-seeking. The Supreme Court's reasoning acknowledged that teenagers are categorically different from adults in judgment and susceptibility, but it also left room for rare cases where the ultimate penalty of lifelong imprisonment might still be imposed after careful review. Miller's apology at an earlier hearing was noted in coverage, but the court weighed against the evidence of the offense and the enduring impact on the victim's family. Evan Miller is currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole following his individualized resentencing in Lawrence County, Alabama. Number 3. Nathan Dean Slayton was 17 years old, a high school-age teen from Albertville in Marshall County, when the quiet routines of a small neighborhood met a devastating rupture. He lived next door to Carrie Medenia Phillips, a 68-year-old retiree known to friends for her church-going reliability and gentle patience. Before the crime, Slayton's public image was unremarkable. A boy seen around the block, occasionally restless, sometimes testing limits in the way adolescents do. Nothing about his day-to-day presence hinted at the profound harm that would follow, making the case feel intensely personal to those who knew the victim as the steady heart of a close-knit street. Context emerged in court through pieces of Slayton's life that suggested immaturity and poor decision-making rather than a detailed plan. Witnesses described him as a teenager whose judgment could slide under pressure and whose impulsivity sometimes surfaced in small but telling acts. On the morning in question, a neighbor noticed Slayton in Phillips's yard, shooting at birds with a BB gun. a detail that prosecutors later used to show his presence and mindset in the hours before the attack. Defense filings across years of appeals emphasized his youth and argued that adolescent development, substance exposure, and chaotic emotions can coalesce into disastrous choices, especially when a teen feels unchecked or emboldened. The crime happened in late May of 1987 inside Phillips's Albertville home. Evidence showed that after the morning encounter in the yard, Slayton was seen approaching her front door and then entering. Within a brief window, the visit turned violent. Phillips was assaulted and killed inside her house. Testimony at trial indicated that her own handgun was used during the final moments. Prosecutors framed the sequence as a fatal convergence of opportunity and aggression within a familiar setting. This was not a stranger encounter but an attack on a next-door neighbor. The state refrained from graphic descriptions, instead leaning on timeline, method, and the stark betrayal of proximity to convey the gravity of what occurred. Investigators moved quickly. The neighbor's observations, physical evidence from the residence, and Slayton's connection to the victim formed the core of the case. He was charged with capital murder, with the offense deemed capital because it occurred during a sexual assault, a legal aggravator under Alabama law. A jury convicted him, and the trial judge imposed a sentence of death. Appeals followed for years, focusing on issues ranging from jury procedures to the sufficiency of evidence. The legal terrain shifted dramatically in the mid-2000s when the United States Supreme Court, in Roper v. Simmons, barred the death penalty for offenders who were under 18 at the time of their crimes. In Alabama, that ruling required that juvenile death sentences be reduced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and Slayton's sentence was accordingly converted. Public reaction drew a hard line between sorrow and anger. Friends and relatives of Carrie Phillips spoke about her kindness and the deep, lingering absence left by her death, voicing consistent opposition to any outcome that might shorten the perpetrator's time in custody. Local coverage at milestones, appeals, hearings, and parole discussions years later captured a community committed to preserving the victim's memory and to keeping the case's consequences in view. Prosecutors, for their part, continued to emphasize the original trial record, eyewitness accounts, the tight timeline, and the physical evidence gathered from the home. Experts and courts have described Slayton's case through the lens of adolescent psychology, limited impulse control, heightened susceptibility to reckless choices, and an underdeveloped capacity to weigh consequences in high-stress or morally fraught situations. Those factors help explain behavior but do not erase accountability. After Roper, later Supreme Court rulings about juvenile life without parole stressed that youthfulness must be considered. Yet they left room for rare cases where judges, exercising discretion or applying controlling law, conclude that permanent incapacitation remains the lawful sentence. Slayton's trajectory settled into that category once his death sentence was vacated. Nathan Dean Slayton is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole for the capital murder of Carrie Modenia Phillips in Albertville, Alabama. Number 4. Mark Anthony Duke was 16 years old, a high school sophomore from Pelham, when the tensions inside his blended family spiraled into a crime that stunned an Alabama suburb. He lived with his father, Randy Gerald Duke, who had recently planned a future with Dedra Mims Hunt and her 2 daughters, Chalisa Nicole and Chelsea Marie. Neighbors knew Mark as a lean, intense teenager who drifted between school and a small circle of friends. Teachers remembered flashes of ability offset by rule testing and a quick temper. What looked from the outside like an ordinary home on Chandawood Drive carried the everyday frictions of adolescence and authority. Frictions that would become central to the story of what happened next. Prosecutors later described pressure points familiar to many families. Arguments about rules, cars, and control. In the days before the killings, Mark clashed with his father over use of a pickup truck, a dispute that friends said left him frustrated and eager to prove himself. He spent increasing time with an older acquaintance, Michael Brandon Samra, whose presence added bravado to teenage defiance. Investigators and, later, appellate courts would frame the case as a combustible mix of adolescent anger, peer reinforcement, and impulsivity, rather than a long-planned scheme. The defense, for its part, pointed to Mark's youth and susceptibility to influence as context for choices that escalated far beyond a household argument. On a Sunday in late March of 1997, inside the Duke's Pelham home, 4 people were killed in a single course of conduct. Randy Duke, Dedra Mims Hunt, and her daughters, Chalisa, who was 6, and Chelsea, who was 7. Evidence showed the adults were shot and that the sequence moved rapidly room to room. The girls were attacked during the chaos. The state's case emphasized timeline, method, and coordination between the teens, without dwelling on graphic detail, underscoring that this was not a random break-in, but violence that unfolded within a family setting. Detectives began with the immediate circle and soon received a crucial lead. A friend reported that Mark had confided in his girlfriend, a 9th grader, about what happened. Working with police, the girl agreed to wear a wire. The recordings captured Mark's friends, discussing the murders in ways that matched facts not publicly known. Those conversations, along with physical evidence from the house and witness accounts placing the teens together, gave investigators the leverage to bring Mark and Michael in for questioning. The picture that emerged was of a volatile argument that mutated into coordinated violence. Mark Duke was charged with capital murder because the killings were committed as one scheme or course of conduct. A jury convicted him and recommended death, and the trial judge imposed a death sentence. Years of appeals followed. Then, national law shifted. The United States Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that people who were under 18 at the time of their crimes cannot be executed. In Alabama, that ruling required converting juvenile death sentences to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Mark's sentence was reduced accordingly, while his older co-defendant, Michael Brandon Samra, later faced execution for his role in the same crime. Families of the victims publicly thanked authorities for their persistence and spoke of a loss that remained fresh despite the passage of years. Psychologically, the case has been interpreted through the lens of adolescent development, an underdeveloped capacity for foresight, heightened reactivity to peer influence, and a readiness to read parental boundaries as challenges to status. Courts noted that those characteristics can explain behavior but do not erase accountability. Capital charges were supported by the multiple victims and the unified course of conduct. Later, Supreme Court decisions about juveniles and sentencing continued to shape the larger legal landscape, but they did not disturb Mark's converted sentence. Mark Anthony Duke is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. Housed within the Alabama Department of Corrections. Number 5. Marcus D. Presley was 16 years old, a Birmingham-area teenager drifting between school and the street, when a plan for fast cash drew him to a small storefront in Westover. The place was John's 280 Pawn, a familiar stop along the highway. Behind the counter that afternoon were the owner, John Burleson, and the store manager, Janice Littleton, both widely known in Shelby County for their steadiness and courtesy with customers. Friends later said Presley could be quiet and guarded, eager to prove himself to older peers. In that summer of the mid-1990s, he was running with LaSamuel Gamble, a slightly older companion, whose bravado gave reckless ideas a hard edge. Pressure points formed in the hours before the crime. Appellate records describe a teenager who first entered the pawn shop alone, looking over the cases and chatting about merchandise, then leaving and returning with his partner. Prosecutors framed that sequence as predatory patience, while the defense in later filings emphasized youth, impulsivity, and the potent pull of an older friend. Those themes, peer influence, the tunnel vision of adolescence, and a fantasy of easy money, would trail the case for decades, even as the facts hardened into a clear timeline supported by video and witnesses. The killings unfolded on Thursday, July 25th, 1996. Inside John's 280 Pawn, a surveillance camera captured Presley at the counter. Minutes later, he returned with Gamble. The encounter turned into a robbery, and both employees were shot. The state's description focused on method and sequence rather than gore. A weapon raised, a burst of panic and command, and a pair of fatal decisions that ended the workday for 2 people who knew the customers by name. The video, later reviewed by appellate judges, showed the shooter's composure broken only by a moment of irritation when his gun briefly misfired. Investigators quickly connected dots. Witnesses recognized the young men. The shop had been scouted on camera. Reports from that summer tied the pair to other robberies across the South, and a multi-state manhunt followed. After roughly 2 weeks on the run, authorities arrested Presley and Gamble in Norfolk, Virginia. A third associate had already been detained in Massachusetts. Physical evidence and the videotape formed the spine of the state's case, leaving little room for alternate narratives about who pulled the trigger at the counter that day. A Shelby County jury convicted Presley of capital murder for killing 2 people during a robbery. By a margin of 11-1, jurors recommended a death sentence. And in early autumn of 1997, the trial judge imposed death. Appeals affirmed the convictions and sentence, with the appellate court remarking on the dispassionate efficiency visible on the tape. Years later, national law changed. In early spring of 2005, the United States Supreme Court in Roper v. Simmons barred executions for those who were under 18 at the time of their crimes, automatically converting Presley's punishment to life without the possibility of parole. Subsequent rulings required individualized sentencing for juveniles, and Presley returned to court for a full hearing. In mid-September of 2024, an Alabama judge resentenced him again to life without parole, the maximum allowed. After considering the factors of youth, public reaction has long centered on the victims and their families. Local coverage revisited John Burleson's reputation as a fair dealer and Janice Littleton's care with customers, and chronicled relatives' steady presence in court through each legal turn. Prosecutors stressed the tight evidence and the lasting harm to a small community. Defense filings returned to adolescent science, reduced foresight, heightened impulsivity, and susceptibility to older peers, ideas that shed light on behavior without undoing a verdict. Psychologically, the case has been read as a collision of teenage bravado and opportunity in a setting built on trust. A pawn shop is personal commerce. Buyers and sellers trade stories as often as goods. That human scale made the loss sharper, and the videotape unforgettable in court. Experts who shape juvenile sentencing law caution that teenagers are different from adults in development, yet the law still permits permanent punishment in rare cases after careful review of framework that ultimately governed Presley's outcome. Marcus D. Presley is incarcerated in the Alabama Department of Corrections, serving life in prison without the possibility of parole for the capital murders of John Burleson and Janice Littleton at John's 280 Pawn in Westover. Number 6. Trace Royal Duncan was 17 years old. A Jefferson County high school-aged teen drifting between part-time work and late nights with friends, when he crossed paths with Vicki Lynn DeBlue, a traveler trying to get home to Louisiana. People who knew him before the crime recall a boy who blended in restless, eager to impress, not yet anchored by steady supervision. On an evening in late winter, he joined 3 companions, including an older friend, and the group encountered DeBlue near an interstate exit outside Birmingham. What began as a ride shared with a stranger would become one of Alabama's most discussed juvenile cases. The pressure behind the moment was a familiar cocktail of youth, alcohol, and bravado. Court records portray 4 young men who had been drinking and using drugs, their judgment narrowing as the night stretched on. Prosecutors later argued that group dynamics did the rest. A search for thrills hardened into cruelty once the group veered off the promised route. The defense emphasized Duncan's age, his susceptibility to influence, and the developmental science that would later reshape national sentencing for juveniles. Those competing lenses, peer pressure versus immaturity, shadowed every phase of the case. The crimes unfolded in Jefferson County in late February of 1994. After offering DeBlue a ride, the group steered to a wooded area and then to a rocky bluff known as Bald Rock. Testimony established a sequence of assault, a desperate attempt by the victim to flee, and her body being taken to the bluff and thrown over the edge. The state's presentation to jurors focused on timeline, locations, and the roles ascribed to each participant, avoiding gratuitous detail while underscoring that the violence was not random but born of choices the group made together. Investigators built the case quickly. Hikers discovered the body days later, and detectives traced leads through witness statements, physical evidence, and boastful remarks within the group that referenced facts not publicly known. Within weeks, police arrested the 4: Carrie Dale Grayson, Kenneth Eugene Loggins, Louis Christopher Manion, and Trace Royal Duncan. Separate trials followed. In the autumn of 1995, Duncan became the first to be convicted, on capital counts tied to kidnapping and robbery. Months later, the judge imposed a death sentence, consistent with the jury's recommendation. Appellate courts upheld his convictions. The legal outcome shifted years later as national law evolved. In early spring of 2005, the United States Supreme Court's decision in Roper v. Simmons barred the execution of people who were under 18 at the time of their crimes. Alabama courts applied Roper to Duncan, vacating his death sentence and resentencing him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Subsequent Supreme Court rulings, Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana, changed how states treat juveniles facing the harshest penalties by requiring individualized sentencing and making those protections retroactive, but they did not void Duncan's underlying capital convictions. Public reaction centered on the victim and her family. Coverage across appeals and resentencing hearings returned to DeBlue's journey and her mother's loss, and to a community that had watched the case reopen with each legal development. For prosecutors, the evidence remained stark: a lurid detour, a remote setting, and a sequence of acts carried out by a group that knew the woman only for a few hours. For the defense, Duncan's youth and the science of adolescent development framed his culpability, without erasing responsibility under the law. Psychologically, expert commentary around comparable cases highlights themes of adolescent impulsivity, intoxication, and the power of peers to escalate risk, especially when an older participant sets the tone. Courts reviewing juvenile sentencings have noted diminished foresight and heightened susceptibility as mitigating features, even while allowing life without parole in rare circumstances after individualized review. Those principles explain the legal arc in which Duncan's punishment changed from death to permanent imprisonment, but his convictions remained intact. Trace Royal Duncan is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole in the Alabama Department of Corrections following the vacatur of his death sentence under Roper and his subsequent resentencing. Number 7. Louis Christopher Manion was 16 years old, a Jefferson County teenager who floated between school, friends, and long drives on back roads, when his name became tied to the killing of a traveler, Vicki Lynn DeBlue. People who knew him before the crime often described a boy who blended in more than he stood out quiet at times, restless at others, and easily pulled along by the momentum of a group. He ran with slightly older companions, young men who spent nights drinking, talking big, and testing limits. That loose circle, and the choices made inside it, would define the case that followed. Prosecutors later drew a picture of converging pressures: youth, intoxication, and the kind of performative bravado that can harden when teenagers jostle for status. In statements to investigators and testimony recounted in court opinions, the group had been drinking and using marijuana when they encountered DeBlue hitchhiking. What began as an offer of a ride south became a detour into isolation. The defense, across years of litigation, emphasized Manion's age and susceptibility to peer influence, arguing that adolescent judgment narrows under stress, and that he did not originate the most violent acts. Those competing lenses, group reinforcement versus immature judgment, frame how the case has been remembered. The crimes unfolded in Jefferson County in late February of 1994. After promising to help her reach the interstate, the group steered to a remote area and then to a rocky overlook locals know as Bald Rock. Court records describe a sequence that shifted from taunting to a sustained attack, and then the disposal of the victim's body over the cliff. The state's narrative to jurors emphasized timeline, locations, and roles rather than graphic detail. Crucially, this was not a story of strangers in passing. It was a brief, fatal relationship created within hours, shaped by intoxication and an escalating group dynamic. Detectives gathered the case through witness accounts, physical evidence, and admissions that included facts not publicly known. One detail that drew attention, boasting about a severed finger, circulated among acquaintances and helped investigators identify suspects. Manion gave a written statement, acknowledging he threw a bottle and was present as events spiraled, while trying to minimize his personal violence. The jury later rejected the idea that he was merely a bystander and found him legally accountable as an accomplice. In court, His liability rested on complicity principles, that a person who intends to aid an offense can be held responsible even if he did not inflict the fatal injuries himself. Tried separately from his co-defendants, Mangione was convicted in the mid-1990s of capital murder during a kidnapping and of intentional murder on a separate count. The appellate court later vacated the duplicate intentional murder conviction under double jeopardy rules, but it affirmed the capital conviction and the sentence that mattered most: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. That punishment reflected Alabama law at the time, which mandated life without parole for juveniles convicted of capital murder when death was not imposed. Years later, national law shifted around him. In late June of 2012, the United States Supreme Court decided Miller v. Alabama, holding that mandatory life without parole sentences for children under 18 are unconstitutional and that judges must consider the hallmarks of youth before imposing the harshest penalty. Subsequent rulings made Miller retroactive, opening resentencing pathways for many people who, like Mangione, had received mandatory terms as teenagers. Alabama courts wrestled with how to apply those decisions, and Mangione's case returned to the docket through post-conviction filings, focused on whether his sentence required a new hearing. Psychologically, the portrait that emerges is of adolescent risk-taking amplified by substances and peer dynamics. Expert commentary in similar cases emphasizes diminished foresight, greater sensitivity to pressure from older companions, and a developing sense of identity that can make reckless choices feel momentarily inevitable. None of that erased legal accountability in Alabama courtrooms, but it shaped the later debate over punishment, how to weigh youth, remorse, and the possibility of growth against the irrevocable harm to the victim's family. Public reaction stayed centered on Vicky DeBlue's life, and the grief of those who waited for answers through trials, appeals, and shifting rules. Louis Christopher Mangione was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for capital murder. Later litigation following juvenile sentencing rulings addressed his mandatory term, and public records reflect that he remains incarcerated in the Alabama Department of Corrections under a life sentence. Number 8. Gary Davis Hart II was 16 years old, a Mobile teenager who split his days between school, odd jobs, and hanging around with an older friend, when a robbery plan turned into a killing that would define his life. Those who knew him then recall a slim, quiet boy who craved respect, someone eager to show he was not a kid anymore. In the summer of the late 1980s, he spent time near a busy commercial strip where restaurants cycled managers through long shifts and predictable cash routines. One of those places was the L&N Seafood Restaurant, where assistant manager Todd Evans kept the books, closed the office at night, and projected the steady competence of a young professional trusted with keys and receipts. Pressure points built in the weeks before the crime. According to prosecutors and later appellate opinions, Hart talked with a friend about targeting the restaurant because he believed he knew where money was stored. The tone, as recounted in court filings, was bravado mixed with impatience. A teenager convinced he had found a shortcut to the adult world of cash and control. Defense filings over the years would emphasize youth, a turbulent home environment, and the kind of immature decision-making that blossoms when a boy tries to perform toughness for a peer. On a Saturday night in mid-August of 1989, Hart and his companion entered the restaurant and moved with purpose toward the office. A staffer led them to Todd Evans, who was working late behind a desk. Witnesses later described commands, a flash of the handgun, and a shot fired at close range. In the scramble that followed, the companion grabbed a small drawer of cash, and the pair ran from the building. There was no elaborate getaway. They sprinted across nearby lots and were spotted, chased, and taken into custody not far away. During the pursuit, Hart threw the handgun. Investigators recovered it and later linked it to the fatal shot. When arrested, he had several $100s in loose bills. The victim had no personal connection to Hart beyond his role as the manager on duty that night. Detectives built a swift, linear case. Employees identified the intruders. Physical evidence tied the discarded pistol to the office shooting, and the sudden cash in Hart's pocket undercut any claim of misunderstanding. A Mobile County jury convicted him of capital murder, murder committed during a robbery, and by a vote of 11 to 1 recommended a death sentence. The trial judge imposed death by electrocution. Appeals followed, and Alabama's appellate courts affirmed the conviction and sentence in opinions that laid out the timeline, the eyewitness accounts, and the evidentiary links between the gun, the money, and the defendant. Years later, the national legal landscape shifted. In early spring of 2005, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that people who were under 18 at the time of their crimes cannot be executed. In light of that decision, Hart's sentence was converted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A subsequent Supreme Court ruling, Miller v. Alabama in mid-2012, and another case making that rule retroactive, required individualized sentencing for juveniles facing life without parole. News coverage documented Hart's efforts to seek relief under those rulings, arguing that youth and its mitigating features warranted a parole-eligible sentence. Psychologically, court records and commentary sketch a familiar pattern: adolescent bravado, a search for status in front of a peer, and a belief that a quick show of force could unlock money without consequences. Experts who inform the Supreme Court's juvenile cases point to underdeveloped foresight, heightened impulsivity, and sensitivity to peer pressure as hallmarks of mid-teens decision-making factors that help explain but do not excuse. In Mobile, public response centered on Todd Evans' colleagues and family, who remembered a hard-working manager whose ordinary shift intersected with a reckless plan, and on the lasting weight of that loss at every legal milestone. Gary Davis Hart II is incarcerated in the Alabama Department of Corrections for capital murder, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole following the vacatur of his death sentence under Roper, with later litigation addressing juvenile sentencing standards. Number 9. James Matthew Hyde was 17 years old, a Marshall County high school-age teen, who split time between class, hanging out with friends, and small-town routines when his life intersected with an investigation that would turn deadly. In Albertville, he was known primarily as a friend of Larry Whitehead, a local man under scrutiny for a payroll theft scheme at a poultry plant. The officer assigned to that case was Detective Ernest Andrew Andy Whitten, a respected investigator and former canine handler, the kind of steady presence whose name was well known in the community. In the weeks before the killing, Detective Whitten had testified before a grand jury and was expected to appear in court again, tightening the pressure around Whitehead, and by extension, Hyde. Prosecutors and later appellate courts would frame the situational trigger in stark terms: a juvenile entangled in an adult's problem, drawn into retaliatory thinking that confused loyalty with a solution. Testimony portrayed a teenager eager to prove himself to older companions, someone susceptible to peer influence and the rush of a daring plan. The defense countered with the familiar hallmarks of youth immaturity, impulsivity, and a brain not yet built for long-range consequences, elements that years later would stand at the center of national rulings about juvenile punishment. On a winter night in late January of 1995, the crime unfolded at Detective Whitten's home in Albertville. According to Hyde's own statement to police, and corroborating testimony from a co-defendant, a car carrying Hyde, Whitehead, and Stephen Brookshire drove to the residence. Hyde stepped onto the enclosed porch and knocked. When the detective came to the interior door, Hyde produced a handgun concealed in his jacket and fired a single shot before the weapon malfunctioned. The trio fled. The victim had no personal relationship with Hyde beyond his role as the investigator whose testimony threatened Whitehead's pending case. Within hours, Albertville and neighboring agencies were mobilized. The wounded detective's identification of his assailants and subsequent investigative steps focused attention squarely on Hyde and his companions. Investigators built a linear case from admissions, eyewitness accounts, and the broader context of retaliation. Hyde gave a recorded statement describing his role. Brookshire testified for the state, aligning with details of Hyde's admission and the timeline of the visit to the house. Whitehead, testifying for the defense, tried to claim responsibility and minimize the other's involvement, a narrative the jury rejected. The state charged Hyde with capital murder on multiple theories, including that the killing occurred during a burglary and that the victim was a grand jury witness who had been subpoenaed to testify. A jury found Hyde guilty, by a narrow margin, Jurors recommended life without parole, but the trial judge overrode that recommendation and imposed a death sentence, a decision later reviewed in a string of appellate opinions. Public reaction was immediate and deeply personal. Detective Whitten was remembered by colleagues and residents as a calm, professional, and a loyal friend, tributes that continued each anniversary of his death. Law enforcement filled courtrooms during appeals and resentencing hearings, while the victim's family spoke about enduring grief and the need for finality. The legal landscape changed in early spring of 2005, when the United States Supreme Court barred executions for those who were under 18 at the time of their crimes. Hyde's sentence was converted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Later, Supreme Court rulings required individualized consideration before imposing such a life term on juveniles. Hyde sought relief under those decisions, but Alabama courts ultimately upheld his life without parole sentence. Psychologically, the case has been read through the lens of adolescent vulnerability to influence and the distortions of retaliatory logic. Expert summaries in juvenile sentencing jurisprudence highlight diminished foresight and heightened susceptibility to older peers' traits that can explain the path to a door on a winter night, even as the law requires accountability for the choice to pull a trigger. For the community, the case has remained a touchstone of loss and resolve, revisited whenever the courts reconsider juvenile sentencing. James Matthew Hyde is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole for the capital murder of Detective Ernest Andrew Whitten in Albertville, Alabama. Number 10. Shaber Chamon Wimberly was 17 years old, a high school-aged teen moving between small jobs and long days on the streets of the Wiregrass, when his name became tied to the quiet home of Max and Jonine King in Midland City. Neighbors remembered the Kings as steady and welcoming. Max, a retiree who still tinkered with projects, and Jonine, warm and attentive to friends and church life. Wimberly, by contrast, had begun spending time with older and younger companions on back roads between Dothan and Dale County, drifting toward risky talk about easy money. To people who later testified, he looked like many adolescents on the edge, restless, eager to impress, and convinced that a shortcut could lift him out of the ordinary. Stressors and triggers emerged later in court records. Prosecutors described a teenager steeped in bravado, carrying a handgun, and planning quick robberies that would, in his mind, prove control and status. Evidence in related proceedings suggested a pattern that winter: watching houses, testing doors, and bragging to peers. The defense emphasized youth, the volatility of late adolescence, and the way group dynamics can narrow judgment in seconds. Those competing portraits, peer-fueled boldness versus immature impulsivity, hung over every phase of the case and would later intersect with national debates about how to sentence juvenile. The crimes unfolded in late January of 1997 inside the King's single-story home. According to trial findings, Wimberly and an accomplice approached the door under a pretext, forced their way in, and turned a robbery into a double killing that moved quickly room to room. The victims were not strangers. They were the homeowners confronted in their own space. The state's presentation emphasized method and timeline entry by ruse, demands for money, and a burst of violence without leaning on lurid detail. The narrative focused on deliberate choices rather than spectacle, and on the stark betrayal of hospitality at a neighbor's doorstep. Investigators closed the circle through eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and statements that matched facts not publicly known. A Dale County jury convicted Wimberly of 5 counts of capital murder, reflecting overlapping legal theories: killings during a robbery, during a burglary, and as part of a single scheme or course of conduct. The jurors voted 10-2 to recommend death, and the trial judge imposed a death sentence. On direct appeal, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals reversed the first conviction because Wimberly's police statement had been admitted in error, but the state retried him. The second jury again found him guilty, and the court again sentenced him to death. Public reaction centered on the couple whose names anchored the case. Friends and relatives of Max and Jonine spoke about generosity and routine, about a front door that should have remained the boundary between safety and harm. Each legal milestone, reversal, retrial, and renewed sentence, reopened grief while reinforcing resolve. Prosecutors continued to frame the evidence as tight and consistent. The defense returned to youth, influence, and the developmental science that would soon alter juvenile punishment nationwide. That legal landscape shifted in early spring of 2005, when the United States Supreme Court held in Roper v. Simmons that people who were under 18 at the time of their crimes cannot be executed. Alabama courts applied Roper to Wimberly, setting aside the death sentence and ordering resentencing to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the only other penalty authorized for a juvenile convicted of capital murder. Subsequent opinions also clarified that evidence from a separate homicide could be admitted in the King's case to establish intent and identity. But none of those rulings changed the bottom line. The conviction stood, and the punishment became permanent life. Psychologically, the portrait that emerges is of adolescent risk-taking heightened by the presence of peers and access to a gun. Courts reviewing juvenile cases routinely note diminished foresight, heightened impulsivity, and sensitivity to group pressure factors that help explain the rush toward a door on a winter night, even as the law demands accountability for what happened after that door opened. For the community, the memory of Max and Jonine King remains the fixed point, invoked whenever the case returns to public view. Shaber Chamon Wimberly is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole for the capital murders of Max and Jonine King in Midland City, Alabama, following the vacatur of his death sentence under Roper.